Alright guys, welcome back for another video of HAIKYU Fly High, and today we're going to do a build guide for SP Kuroo. Now SP Kuroo have basically two actions he can perform, a block and also receive. So some people's first reaction will be that you might have to tweak your potential so that it's specifically focused on just block or just for receive. The reality is that you don't really have to do that, at least not for kind of the main things. The main reason is going to be because both block and also receive that defensive actions, and what that basically means is that stats such as defense technique, reflex, and also spirit, etc., they will be applied as multipliers to both block and also receive at the same time. So if you have to only take one thing away from today's video, it's going to be that when you're actually building the potential for SP Kuroo, do not focus on loads of ones which actually says block or just says receive. Instead, focus on the main stats and also the substat where it actually says spirit, reflex, and also defense technique. Okay, because this way you would then actually be able to build one version of Kuroo where he's actually going to be good at both block and also receive simultaneously. Okay, so let's just go through in a bit more details. So first of all, potential sets. The four sets you want is definitely going to be Forceful God, and the reason for this is that once again, this one is actually able to buff up both crit, receive and also block at the same time. There is going to be a condition of crit, but you will see later on it's actually going to be very easy to trigger that. So this one is almost guaranteed, and obviously this is going to be better than any one which only focus on just block or just receive. Now, as for the two-piece, here is where you can then actually have a bit of a choice, where you build him leaning towards a bit more onto the block side or onto more on the receive side. The main thing you will see the difference is just going to be this two-piece effect, so basically a 15% difference. Now, if you do actually want to build him towards like a blocking build, it doesn't really matter the position of your potentials. However, if you actually want to build him into a receiving build, then what you have to make sure is that your slot 1 here, it has to be from a receiving potential rather than Forceful God. Okay, and the reason is I can show you. Even the Forceful God, if you actually take a look at the force piece effect, it basically buff up both receive and block. However, when it's actually on top slot 1, the main stats that Forceful God will give is always going to be block. Okay, so you can see I have all of those Forceful God and all of them have the main stat of block. So this one's going to be fixed, and that's going to work if you actually want to build your Kuroo with a secondary into receive. Then what you actually want to do is pick one of those receiving ones as slot 1, just so that you have a tiny bit of extra stats there. Okay, so that's just something for you guys to bear in mind. Now, if you have to decide which one you want to go for, it kind of as a second stat between block and receive, the biggest decision you have to make is obviously based on your team composition. If your team composition have less blockers and therefore you require your Kuroo to be more like a blocker, then obviously you build a block two-piece here. If you have your team already overloaded with lots of blockers, because for example, you might be doing a block specialty team, etc., right? And in that kind of cases, you may want your Kuroo to be a bit more receive focused, and then you would just simply have your two-piece slots to be on receiving instead. Now, if everything's being equal and you still can't make up your mind, then personally I would recommend you guys go for block rather than receive, and there are two reasons for this. Reason number one is going to be if you actually happen to have him as skill runner 2, what you can see is that he will actually buff up your character spike based on his block stat. So obviously the higher block you have, the better buff it will be given. Okay, and then the second reason is going to be more down to your team positioning, which is that when Kuroo is actually at the back, a lot of time people will be having your liberal also subbing on for a different position at the back as well. Well, if you are going to sub out your Kuroo when he's at the back, then obviously you only want your Kuroo to be doing the blocks when he's up front anyway. But let's say even if your Kuroo is going to stay on the field, there should be someone else on your team which is already been subbed out by your liberal, and what that basically means is that you're already guaranteed to have one strong receiver outside of Kuroo. Whereas for block specialities, it sometimes can actually be a bit harder for you to balance kind of all of the different blockers, and there will definitely be rotations where Kuroo may end up being the only blocker up front, and therefore he has to be there for every single block. Whereas for when he's actually at the back, no matter what's going to be the rotation, the liberal will always be there. So in that kind of cases, receive is not going to be as important as block, because Kuroo might be the only blocker, but he would never really be the only receiver. Okay, so if everything's being equal and you still can't make up your mind, personally I would lean towards building him with a secondary block potential rather than a secondary receive. Okay, so that's going to be my suggestion in terms of the potential set. Now, talking about the main stats, your main stat for slot 6 should definitely be defense technique because, like I said, this can buff up also receive and also block. So this is definitely what you want. For your slot 2, there are actually quite a few different variations you can do. A lot of people think, Kuroo doesn't really have any attack, so it doesn't really matter. That is slightly off purely because there are two things that he can do, which still use attack stats. One is going to be when he's actually rotated to the surfing position, in which case obviously a higher surf would be helpful. And then the other thing is that if you do actually have SP Kenma, he does have a deployment bond as well, where he would actually be performing performing a quick spike, and that's also going to be guaranteed to be critical as well. Okay, and you definitely want to use this because this can actually give you a nice buff for the remainder of the entire match. And for that reason, depending on whether or not you actually have SP Kenma here, what you can actually do is that if you do have SP Kenma and want to buff up your damage for that deployment bomb because you will be activating it, what you can do is go for the main stat of the quick spike or strength. You don't need awareness anymore because it's guaranteed to be crit, so you don't need awareness, but instead you want to go for either quick spike or strength instead. Or if you do not have SP Kenma, then the only place Kuroo will actually be doing any kind of attacks will be when he is surfing, and then you can go for main stat of surf instead. Okay, so that's going to be slot 2. And then for slot 4, you can either go for spirit or reflect, and this will once again be down to your team composition. And the reason for this is that if you actually take a look at his skill 3, what you can see is that he can actually essentially take a portion of your other teammates in the same role and their reflex and spirit. Okay, so if you actually have a team where your team is naturally going to be high in reflex, and it's quite easy for you to build that kind of team. For example, if you actually have SP Kenma, he can give a 32.5% reflex to your whole team. And what 32.5% on Kuroo is going to mean is that he will be getting 32.5 from Kenma directly, and then he will also be getting another 32.5 from the other teammates on the same role who are also getting that buff from Kenma. Okay, so let's say if you actually have someone who's capable of doing like a team-wide reflex buff, it's going to be very easy for your Kuroo to have very high reflex. And in those kind of cases, your slot 4 can then be built with spirit main stat, or alternatively, if you actually have teammates with really high spirit, then what you can do instead is actually have your slot 4 to be very high in reflex instead. Okay, so it's just going to be depending on which stats you have a bit more on your team composition. Now, once again, if everything is being equal and let's say you don't have a buffer for either reflex or spirit on your team, then in those kind of cases, personally, I'm going to lean towards building him with reflex just so that you can even trigger that critical condition. And that's also going to be quite important because his skill 1 does have this ability of applying debuff whenever you do a critical touch. So you do actually want to increase the consistency of you doing a crit. So if you don't have any buffers for reflex or spirit at all, then I would actually suggest you have your slot 4 potential to be with reflex main stats instead. Okay, so that's going to be the stats and the main stats and also substats recommendation for SP Kuroo. Now, in terms of a team composition, obviously the ideal scenario is that you want to have your 2 characters which are on either side of SP Kuroo to be the ones with higher spirit or reflex so that he can always benefit from that no matter what kind of rotation you end up into. However, I would always say that make sure your team rotation is optimal first before kind of tweaking this kind of minor things, because you definitely don't want to, for example, put all of your high reflex blockers up front in so that you actually end up in a situation when all of your blockers are rotated to the back, you have no one capable of blocking up front. Okay, so you should try to have the ones with higher reflex and spirit on either side of Kuroo, but this shouldn't be at an expense of making your natural team rotation less optimal. Okay, so that's just something for you guys to bear in mind. Okay, lastly, I'm going to talk about his memory. So the best memory for SP Kuroo is going to be his own memory, and the reason is that it increases a lot of defense technique when the opponent has debuff, and like I said, his skill 1 can already trigger that debuff ability, so it's very easy for you to get this whooping 20% defense technique. And then as a general rule of thumb, because SP Kuroo can do both block and also receive, you want memories which can actually buff up defensive technique. Okay, so if you do not have SP Kuroo's 1, the next best option is going to be SP Ionis 1, because this one actually buff up defense technique as well. So this will help towards both your block and also receive. And if you do not have this one, then the next best one you can go for is actually going to be the SSR version of Ionis 1, because once again, it buff up your defensive technique. Now, if you do not have this either, then the other alternative you can go for can be like Tendo's 1 or Washio's 1, for example. That's also very universal, but those ones would also help towards your block, not your receive. So that's kind of why they're not not quite as good as the ones which are actually able to include the defense technique buff inside the memories themselves. Okay. All right, so that's everything to cover on SP Kuroo. Let me know what you guys think and also how you are planning to build him in the comment section.